Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lori Dajose. I am a content and media strategist in Caltech's Office of Strategic Communications, and I am a Caltech alum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Conversations on Sustainability. This series is hosted by the Caltech Science Exchange, which is a great web resource full of science explainers on topics from COVID to quantum science. As part of this sustainability webinar series, we're hearing from scientists and engineers working on cutting-edge research and technology that can help address the challenge of climate change. I'm joined today by two Caltech microbiologists, Dianne Newman and Victoria Orphan. Today, they're here to talk about tiny organisms called microbes that they both study and how microbes actually have a lot to do with climate change. So Dianne and Victoria, thank you so much for being here. And to start off, let's just define what we're talking about. Let's define microbes and how have microbes influenced the evolution of life on Earth and how they influence the planet. And Victoria, we'll start with you.
That's a great question. It's great to be here. So microbes really are an umbrella term for life that is, for the most part, invisible to the naked eye. And this includes bacteria, archaea, and unicellular eukaryotes like protists and fungi, and even viruses. And these microbes represent the earliest forms of life on our planet, some 3.8 billion years ago. And over these billions of years, they've co-evolved and also shaped the chemical and physical environment in which we live. And they've basically paved the way for the evolution of multicellular life, like plants and animals. And collectively, I would say these microbes are like the champions of ecosystem engineering. And so really one poignant example I can give you in terms of profound effects that they've had on the planet is the invention of oxygenic photosynthesis. So the ability to use sunlight to split water, of course, is important not only in the production of oxygen, which we all depend upon, but also because they were able to fix carbon dioxide. And so in turn, this sort of changed the total amount of biomass that could be sustained on the planet. And so all of these processes, as well as the nutrients that these organisms are collectively cycling through these microscale ecosystems are truly influencing our planet, and they're really our lifeline in creating this environment that is habitable for us.
Great, thank you so much for that. So can each of you tell me a little bit more about your particular research focus? What kind of microbes do you study and why? And Dianne, we can start with you on this one.
Sure. Well, Victoria provided such a great introduction to this webinar, and I just want to chime in and reinforce what she said, is that microbes really are the prime movers on this planet in ways that we're continuing to discover. And I think that perhaps many in the audience might be familiar with thinking about the microbiome with respect to human health. And indeed, this in the past decade or more has come to be appreciated as an incredibly exciting aspect of human health. And our friends at Caltech, including people like Sarkis Mazmanian, are working towards understanding that. I think what Victoria and I are going to hope to convey to you today is that microbes are also able to play an equally important role contributing to planetary health. And they've been doing this for billions of years, like Victoria said. And so there's so many aspects of this, but the part that intrigues me in particular are the strategies that microbes use to conserve energy. And I love this as a general topic because it really reaches into every facet of life on the planet, not only human life, but also the life of plants and other organisms. So for me, what I try to do in my research is pick bacteria to study that have metabolisms that are very fundamental, that are as relevant in the context of soil and what sustains communities in soil as they are to what sustains microbial communities in chronic infection. Because what I always am reminding myself and my students of is the fact that at the microbe scale, the microbe only knows what's in its immediate surroundings and is rather agnostic to what is at a much larger distance. And so it's possible to utilize methods of modern genetics to pick organisms that are tractable, that are important environmental organisms, but nevertheless ones that we can bring into the laboratory and cultivate and come to learn how it is that they catalyze these remarkable processes that interface with their environment and change their environment in profound ways. And so our goal is to understand how they do that so that we can predict in diverse contexts what they will be doing and ultimately gain the ability to manipulate and control them towards good ends.
Fantastic. And so I'll also chime in that you know, thing that's most fascinating about microorganisms not only is the way that they're controlling their microscale environment, but then the profound impact that has on these global scale processes, and really being able to understand how these small microscale interactions translate to the larger scale is one of the grand challenges for the field, and something I think that both Dianne and I share in terms of like a stretch goal going forward that hopefully the scientists here at Caltech can contribute to. My main interest is really in microorganisms that live in ocean ecosystems. And the oceans really is our largest biome on Earth, representing like 71% of our planet's surface. And the microbes that live in that environment, just like in the soil and terrestrial systems and our own bodies, are really critical for controlling Earth's climate and sustainability on the planet. And so it's really quite shocking given how big this ecosystem is and the impact that it has, that so little of the ocean environment has been studied by scientists, somewhere on the order of 5%. And so for me, this is a real wonderful opportunity for new discovery that can have profound impacts. And so a lot of our research is in deep ocean environments, looking at the roles that microorganisms play on the methane cycle. And just like CO2, methane is another one of these greenhouse gases that is dynamically changing over time. And the oceans are huge reservoirs for methane. A lot of this is in the form of ice rimming the continents, so it's known as methane hydrates. And very little of this methane actually gets up into the atmosphere because microorganisms are basically serving as a biological filter in the sediments. And these organisms have been very difficult to study in the lab. So the kinds of genetic tools that Dianne has been able to bring to bear to study certain model organisms in the laboratory, 99% of the microorganisms in environmental systems can't be grown and studied with those kinds of techniques. And so we have been really interested in trying to come up with ways to learn by looking at the genomic information from these organisms and using geochemical tools to try to assess how these organisms are interacting and the types of metabolisms that they're engaging in the environment directly. So we look at the community rather than at the individual microbe for a large part. And in the case of methane, this turns out to be a real effective way of studying them, because the way that these organisms oxidize methane is not through a single organism doing this, but through a symbiosis of the collaboration of metabolisms that allow them to take methane and couple it with sulfate and seawater. And so we've been very interested in how these organisms do this, how they make a living with very little energy, but yet do this globally important process, and how to study this really in the deep ocean that is so remote and difficult to study compared to what we're doing in the laboratory back home. So really our research stretches from deep ocean ecosystems to what we can do looking at the genes and metabolites in the laboratory back here at Caltech.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think maybe you touched on this a little bit already, but I think when most people think of microbes, they might think of the germs that make us sick. And so I'm wondering, why is it important to study microbes in the context of the broader biosphere and planet? And Dianne, you can start us off if you'd like.
Yeah, I think you're right, Lori. It's a common misconception to think of microbes as pathogens, and I think that that is a vestige of the last century where a lot of microbiology was oriented towards understanding how pathogens work. But what we now know is that of the literally millions of microbial species on the planet, less than 100 are thought of to be hardcore pathogens. So that means the vast majority, whether they're in the ocean sediments or whether they're within our own human gut, are doing things that are actually really vital for the life of the planet and its inhabitants. And so knowing that is really very exciting because it means that we can start looking, as Victoria said, to discover new things about the living world. And while Vic is right that, you know, classically, it has been challenging to cultivate many of these environmental organisms, certainly from, you know, extreme habitats at deep pressures at the bottom of the oceans. That's beginning to actually get easier now. And in, you know, our current 21st century, we are able to, in fact, characterize habitats in all sorts of environments to the extent that we're actually much better able to simulate them in the laboratory. And that's extremely exciting because what it means is that there no longer need be a divide between sort of environmental characterization understanding and the ability to gain a deeper mechanistic insight into how these catalytic organisms, wherever they might be, do their thing. And I think one of the things that makes me love metabolism so much is that what we're recognizing is through evolution, a lot of the inventions that came about that allowed microbes to catalyze certain types of reactions, you know, can be found widespread in the microbial world. And so if you're able to get an organism into culture that has a property you care about, oftentimes what you learn regarding the ways in which that organism catalyzes that reaction are actually shared by organisms that are harder to cultivate. And so I think that there is a fantastic opportunity these days to iterate between laboratory work and environmental work such that it's really symbiotic, and I think is going to give us insight into all sorts of important realms of where microbes impact the planet.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Dianne. And it's one of the wonderful things about being at a place like Caltech with people like you is this ability to bridge across this challenging divide of working directly in the environment and then also having these really critical reductionist approaches to really understand at a mechanistic level. And so really this iteration between the two of laboratory and environment, I think is a real poignant way of approaching these ecosystem sciences. And just thinking more broadly, you know, it's been only in several years, and I think a large part due to sort of the recognition that the human microbiome is important for human health, that the general public has gained, I think, a greater interest in microorganisms, and maybe this recognition that they are more than just these, you know, pathogen type organisms to be feared. And, you know, thinking about the fact that they are hard to see, yet they're so pervasive around us and have such a profound impact is I think one of the biggest challenges for us in terms of communication to everybody, that they should be paying attention to the microbial world. And really our ability to understand biology in general, I think, is integrated with our understanding of microorganisms simply because we've evolved in a microbial world. They were here on the scene billions of years before us. They basically have changed the whole planet. And so really, I think the secret to understanding mechanism, evolution, everything is really tied in with the microorganisms. And it's something that I think we uniquely can do at Caltech in terms of being able to integrate across these different fields. And so it's a very exciting time. Microorganisms play huge roles, as I mentioned in the beginning, in terms of the impact on geochemical cycles. And I often like to say the oceans, for instance, the single cell organisms in the ocean contribute half of the oxygen in our atmosphere. So it's not just the trees and plants on land, it's these single-celled organisms that make up a fraction of the biomass that terrestrial plants do, but they are playing this critical role in oxygen production and in basically burial of carbon in the ocean. And so these are all sort of outstanding questions that go hand in hand with our understanding of future climates and how these organisms are going to respond. And so it's an exciting time, I think, to be studying this field.
Can I just jump in and reinforce what Vic just said? I want to comment on the evolutionary aspect. You know, microbes didn't evolve. I don't mean to say microbes, plants and animals did not evolve in a sea of Purell, right? Like we were solvated by the microbial world from the get-go. And so knowing that makes it almost inconceivable that an intimate relationship with these organisms wouldn't sustain almost all life as we know it, just given that evolutionary fact. And so I think that, you know, it does translate directly to issues that relate to climate. For instance, the fact that in the soil, you have these incredible communities of microbes that are helping plants acquire nutrients and grow is extraordinarily important to the terrestrial biomass being what it is, and thinking of how it's going to evolve into the future as the climate changes. And as Victoria mentioned, you know, in the marine realm, absolutely, the phytoplankton, the marine microbes there are critically important for not only helping to keep the balance of oxygen in our atmosphere, but are also very important with the global carbon cycle. And I think something that's not as appreciated as it might be is even in the terrestrial realm, this sink for carbon, for coming from global anthropogenic carbon emissions, the fraction that goes and is stored within the soils is estimated to be around 30% of the total. And I believe a similar percent is thought to go into the oceans as a sink for current anthropogenic emissions. And so given that in these habitats you have microbes that are so numerous and so critical to processing that carbon and directing its fate, means that it's really important to understand how they work. Not only to predict what's going to happen globally to cycling of carbon and other elements, but to be able to then translate our scientific understanding into action, to think of how we might do things to help adapt and mitigate to the changes that climate change will bring.
Yeah, great, thanks. It's such a good reminder to remember that we live in a microbial world. So how have the effects of anthropogenic climate change that we're seeing now, for example, sea level rise, hotter and drier conditions in some places, ocean acidification, how have those climate change effects affected microbes? And is there some sort of danger of certain microbes becoming extinct, for example? And for this question, we can start with Vic.
Yeah, so I'll talk about this from the context of ocean ecosystems and then turn it over to Dianne to maybe talk a little bit about terrestrial impacts. But certainly there has been a number of concerning changes in ocean ecosystems related to climate change. You mentioned one in terms of ocean acidification. Another is expanding oxygen minimum zones and dead zones that happen when you have an excess of nutrients that are being transported from land systems into the ocean. And all of these things are having dramatic impacts on the local ecosystems that not only impact the microbes themselves, but also then scale up to the higher trophic levels as well. So fisheries, for instance, in coastal environments, those coastal communities can be smothered by lack of oxygen because of high rates of microbial metabolism that's fueled by these excess nutrients coming from land. And so all of these things we're seeing amplified because of these imbalances that are happening due to climate change. Ocean acidification is one that is particularly concerning and probably has a number of sort of nonlinear types of impacts on these ecosystems that we're still trying to understand. But any sort of organism that has a calcium carbonate shell that they're building, of course, will be impacted by having more acidified conditions in the ocean. So the more CO2 that's basically absorbed by the ocean, the lower the pH gets. And then this has impacts on the carbonate system in those environments. And so researchers across the globe are sort of like in a race against time now to try to better understand the broader implications of ocean acidification. For our research, we're interested in coastal environments. So I talked about my research in the deep sea. We're more recently been working on coastal vegetated ecosystems. And these are sort of marine plants that are huge sequesterers of carbon. And they're also thought to buffer against some of the effects of ocean acidification. And so there's, I think, a pretty active area of new research to be done, looking at these ecosystems, not only in the deep sea, but also along the continents that all play a role in how much carbon is buried, how the health of these ecosystems are sustained with increasing climate change and increasing CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, I once heard somebody say microbes were the first in and are going to be the last out in terms of the life on this planet. And so I think that that's actually very profound and important for us to realize, because microbes are always evolving and adapting at a pace that's extraordinary, and something that potentially, if we understand it, can be leveraged for the human population. So I think another example, I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it again, is that we now very much appreciate that there's a large amount of carbon that is stored in soil. But what we don't understand very well are the mechanisms that enable it. We know that it involves a complex interrelationship between certain types of microbes, such as mycorrhizal fungi, which are associated with nearly all plants on Earth in intimate associations. And these fungi help provide the plants with nutrients and water that allow them to thrive. But what is also the case is that within the soil, there are many other kinds of microbes in addition to the fungi that form a community that makes the entire ecosystem whole. And so one of the main questions that a lot of microbial ecologists are now beginning to work towards is gaining a predictive understanding of how these ecological systems are going to evolve in different parts of the world, both in the northern latitudes, where a lot of soil is stored in the frozen tundras, but as the planet is warming, it risks not necessarily staying there. But we're unable really to predict what will happen at the moment, because we lack a quantitative understanding of which organisms are present in this habitat, what they're doing, and how they're going to respond. The good news is that those type of questions are answerable through targeted experiments, and there's a growing movement amongst our community to do just that, because it's very well recognized that this is an important driver potentially on climate that is a huge black box and needs illumination in order for climate models to be more accurate. But by the same token, in addition just to being able to better predict what will happen, there's of course an urgent need to respond and to try to adapt and to mitigate changes. And so one other element of studying microbes in soil habitats is that, of course, agriculture occupies a relatively significant fraction of land use globally. And that is already a system that is managed by humanity. And therefore, if we can gain a better understanding of land usage and agricultural practice, such that it can be done in a way that facilitates carbon storage in soil, that would obviously be a very beneficial and actionable thing to do. And so I think that there's another case of where understanding what microbes are actually doing in situ and doing it in a way where we understand it well enough at the mechanistic level that we can actually tweak the system in a desirable direction is important. One final thing that I can't help but say is, of course, not all microbes are good. We have to also acknowledge that. I think given the past couple of years, if we include, viruses within our microbial world, this is not news to anyone. There are obviously bad things that can happen. And as the climate is changing, so are the ranges of certain pathogens. This is something important that we need to be aware of, to be able to monitor, and also to be able to adapt to. So that's yet another motivation for thinking about microbes in the context of climate change.
Yeah, thank you both for those answers. And I know both of you have touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to specifically ask about the ways that microbes can help us address climate change. I know you both talked about the carbon sinks in the soil, but yeah, I mean, maybe Dianne, you could start with just some like concrete ways that we think that microbes can help us address climate change.
Sure, there's so many examples. I'll just stick with my agricultural theme to give one. The utilization of fertilizer causes all sorts of environmental problems. The overutilization of fertilizer, of course, plants, crops need nutrients to grow, and we want crops in order to feed the global population. But what we don't want is to wastefully use nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus, because if we use them in a wasteful way, not only do we run the risk of depleting natural reserves, say of phosphate rock, or continuing to generate nitrogen and fertilizer through industrial processes that themselves are actually environmentally harmful. So there's an incentive to think about how might we harness the microbial world's natural ability to be very resourceful, literally and figuratively, in helping crops gain these nutrients. And it's been known for many, many decades, for instance, that there are certain types of microbes that have symbioses with certain types of crops, for instance, legumes, soybeans is a good example, where bacteria in the soil are able to naturally take nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into a form that the plant can use. If we only understood how to affect that ability more broadly across a lot of different crops, that would be a game changer. That would give us an opportunity to have a much more sustainable source of nitrogen for crops. Similarly, if there were a way that microbes in the soil could be deployed to help the phosphorus that is present in the rocks in the soil to be more bioavailable to plants, that would also be an actionable item. And these are not pipe dreams. These are goals that are tractable with dedicated research and insight, and also something that I see in the future as being really necessary, in fact, to improve sustainable land management practices for agriculture. So that's one example, and Vic, I'm sure, can give you some other great ones.
Yeah, I think that those are wonderful examples, Dianne. And another piece of all of this too that I think is really important in terms of our thinking about microorganisms in this context is that it's not likely to be one super microbe that is the panacea that's going to solve these problems. It's really thinking about things as an ecologist, right? It's these collectives of organisms that not only are more robust to changes over in terms of environmental shifts, but also can catalyze processes that oftentimes a single organism can't do on its own. And so we really should be thinking about this in terms of the ecosystem and collectives of microorganisms rather than a single microbe. The same sort of thing applies in microbial environments in the ocean too. So carbon sequestration is a big question, and of course people are working hard to try to figure out how to utilize microorganisms not only to enhance greater burial of carbon. So I mentioned these vegetated coastal ecosystems. These seagrass communities are huge storages of carbon. So the plant basically fixes carbon dioxide through oxygenic photosynthesis, and a lot of that carbon ends up buried in in the soil there. And we don't fully understand the mechanisms that are driving that. But if we can figure that out, the microbes are playing a huge role in burying that carbon. A lot of it is done by microorganisms that don't breathe oxygen, but rather use a whole host of different chemicals. And if we can understand the secrets to the success of how that carbon gets locked in, this is another opportunity for us to enhance further carbon burial and productivity in these coastal environments. And so there's exciting opportunities, I think, for crosstalk between what's going on in the study of agriculture and also applying to these other types of marine ecosystems, where there's probably fundamentals that are key to both of these that are going to be important for how we approach ecosystems in the face of climate change going forward.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for those answers. I know it's almost time to move to the audience Q&A, but I know that Dianne, you wanted to share a story about how you got inspired to study this line of work, and Victoria as well. I don't know, Dianne, did you want to read that? The quote that you had prepared for this?
I'm happy to, and this is a quote that is really as much, if not more, about Victoria as it is about me, but it's something that I think is very beautiful and very relevant. So this is a quote that actually both of us read, I believe, before we began our faculty appointments here at Caltech. It's from a book by E.O. Wilson entitled The Naturalist that he wrote in 1994. And what he writes, and just to set the stage, if you've never heard of E.O. Wilson before, he's an extraordinarily famous ecologist who spent his career studying larger creatures than microbes. And here's what he wrote at the very end as he was reflecting back. He wrote, "If I could do it all over again and relive my vision in the 21st century, I would be a microbial ecologist. 10 billion bacteria live in a gram of ordinary soil, a mere pinch held between thumb and forefinger. They represent thousands of species, almost none of which are known to science. Into that world I would go with the aid of modern microscopy and molecular analysis. I would cut my way through clonal forests sprawled across grains of sand, travel in an imagined submarine through drops of water proportionately the size of lakes, and track predators and prey in order to discover new life ways and alien food webs. All this, and I need venture no farther than 10 paces outside my laboratory building. The jaguars, ants, and orchids would still occupy distant forests in all their splendor, but now they would be joined by an even stranger and vastly more complex living world, virtually without end." So I think it's fair to say Victoria and I are both quite inspired by this in different and incredibly complementary ways. She and I have sort of pursued various aspects of this advice using tools of modern microscopy and molecular analysis. I think we jointly very much agree that there's an incredible array of important things to discover for the next generation. And we believe that microbial ecology and all of the phenomenal chemistry that is inherent, that binds the microbial ecosystems to each other, is a source of potentially some of the most important pieces of information that are going to drive us forward into this next century, that are going to be incredibly important, not only to understanding our world, but to being able to help steward it in a sustainable way. You can look no farther than our colleague Frances Arnold to see a great example of someone who harnesses the evolutionary potential of microbes to catalyze reactions using green chemistry in ways that are beneficial to achieve the ability to produce products that are essential for humanity to have, an example of what I was just talking about. So I think that Caltech is an amazing place for this. And we're really grateful, Lori, that you invited us to talk about it, and are delighted now, if it's time to answer questions from the audience, to expand in ways that people are interested in. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And I love that quote. I think it's just so moving. So we can move to audience questions now. So one of the first questions is there any evidence that microbes are mutating to thrive in higher CO2 concentrations? And whoever wants to take this.
I mean, I can say a little work has been done in marine microbes, so cyanobacteria, for instance, where they have exposed them to higher CO2 concentrations in what are known as mesocosm experiments. So it's basically taking larger parcels of seawater where you manipulate the CO2 concentration in one and you hold the other steady. And so in those kinds of experiments, what you see oftentimes is an elevation of photosynthetic activity. So the cells can fix more carbon dioxide with elevated CO2. And you might think that that's a good thing, but there are all these other unintended effects that can happen there. So whether or not all that photosynthate that's fixed leads to new biomass, or whether it's excreted as small molecules into the environment, makes a big difference in how much of that carbon actually ends up totally sequestered into the deep ocean. And so there's still all of these complex interactions between bacteria that are eating those small molecules and the cells themselves that really impact the total fate of how much of that carbon ultimately ends up sequestered. And these are the critical questions we need to be asking about it. So there is evidence of adaptation, but whether or not they're always going to lead to beneficial things, or whether or not this is going to create imbalances in the ecosystem, I think remain to be answered.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, the next question is there research into genetically modified microbes for end goals like promoting photosynthesis or creating alternative foods?
Yes, there's quite a bit of research, and this is often called these days the realm of synthetic biology. Back a few decades ago, people would use the word genetically modified organisms basically to say the same thing. There is extraordinary potential through the power of new tools in genetic engineering to modify organisms for all sorts of purposes. And one of the most, I think, profound questions that we're now facing is how to harness the immense power of synthetic biology in an ecologically responsible way. This is something that lots of people are thinking about, and I think is going to be a critical question to answer in order to be able to fully fill the promise of our ability to tap into the microbial world and what it can do catalytically, such that we can use it as a tool if we're trying to engineer it in different contexts, including in nature. That needs to be done very thoughtfully and carefully, and is something that people are thinking about very hard.
Great, thank you, Dianne. And I also just want to say thank you to the audience. There are so many good questions. I don't think there's time to get through all of them, but we will try. So the next one is, how far away are we from knowing enough to be able to treat disturbed soils in specific land ecosystems to reestablish the right soil microbes and optimize sequestering carbon with plant growth?
Well, I think that it depends on what the specific aspect of the soil is that one is trying to change or to remediate. I think that there are certain things we can do now much better than other things where a larger gap of basic understanding still remains. I will give an example of what I think we can do well. For instance, I got interested in this topic back in the late, well, not so late, in the early 1990s, because when I was a student in environmental engineering in my graduate program, I took a course where I learned about the power of bioremediation, the ability of microbes in sedimentary habitats to eat toxic organic solvents like perchloroethylene and to be able to mineralize them to carbon dioxide. This is something that we've known that microbes can do and are doing in the world for literally decades. And it's extremely exciting. It's inspiring. Naturally, like for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico, maybe Victoria can speak more to this, we know for a fact that the ability to clean up the Deepwater Horizon spill was made entirely possible by the microbes within that area. And so they are already doing this, and that is an extraordinarily important thing. It's also the case that microbes are used in biocontrol for the protection of certain crops against fungal pathogens. These are things that have been ongoing now for decades. To get to the part that I think is sort of the bigger lift where there's still a gap, and it's in part due to the fact that it's a community effort, like Victoria was emphasizing. Microbes rarely live alone. There's really like a magic bullet for you. Put in one organism, you solve the problem. The question of how it is that carbon is stored in soils and whether we can change practices in farming. People talk about regenerative agriculture as possibly one way we might greater facilitate carbon storage. That sounds really good, but I think it's also fair to say that there's a lot more that needs to be done scientifically to ground truth, whether or not that indeed is a solution. And I'm optimistic that within the coming decade, actually, we're going to learn a lot about that in a way that may indeed translate within a decade or so into practical implementation that is really grounded in quantitative information about microbial ecology and the mechanisms sustaining the processes in the soils. So I'm hopeful, but there, of course, is a lot yet to learn.
Yeah, and I think there are different approaches that both should come to play in terms of how we approach ecosystems in the future, whether it is sustaining continued ecosystem services as they're provided today, or trying to enhance agricultural, food security into the future. It's really going to be this sweet spot of not only working with synthetic communities that maybe we can control and enhance certain properties through genetic types of techniques, but also a better understanding of the ecology of the natural communities that are there. So, Dianne mentioned the Deepwater Horizon spill. This wasn't a system where we were sprinkling on hydrocarbon degrading organisms. There's this old saying by Bass Becking that everything is everywhere and the environment selects. So it turns out that there are inherent properties within microorganisms that live naturally in these environments that can degrade hydrocarbons. They may be limited by an essential nutrient, for instance, that might hold them back from their full degradation potential. We can understand how those natural ecosystems work and how those interactions occur at a fundamental level. We may be able to goose natural communities into enhancing the ability and also resiliency in these ecosystems going forward.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And I think maybe this next question kind of plays off of that last one. How close are we to utilizing the metabolic processes you're researching in order to do things like metabolize greenhouse gases, clean up oil spills, so on?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the question at hand. So there are many of us at Caltech who've been having these conversations about methane production in livestock, for instance, right? And that's a microbial problem, right? Not problem, but ruminants generate methane as part of this, and we have a big bovine problem in the world in terms of how much livestock we are producing, and this is contributing a lot of methane to the atmosphere. It is highly likely that the solution to that is a microbial one in trying to better understand how to divert maybe the production of methane in the rumen of these organisms. And so that's a hot area of research that I think we will be able to make progress in the next decade that should help with curbing that greenhouse gas. I always come at these problems from an ecological perspective. And so another example is looking at rice fields, right? So a lot of these waterlogged terrestrial systems are also big methane producers. But we know from ecological systems that you can inhibit methanogens by enhancing other types of microbial processes, whether that's denitrification or sulfate reduction. And so people are starting to use those kinds of concepts to better control methane in these types of ecosystems as well. So again, I think there's a lot of potential here in terms of being able to use our common sense and the things that we're learning about these ecosystems to apply them in ways that help ameliorate some of these issues.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I would just again draw attention to the human microbiome as an inspiring example and as something that makes me feel that if enough attention is placed in a certain area, progress can be made incredibly quickly. And so 2 decades ago, we were nowhere near where we are today with regard to a fundamental scientific understanding of the importance of microbes in human health, much less at the point where people were starting to make companies to think through how to produce probiotics that are genuinely going to work, that are actually really resting on a foundation of basic science. But now we're getting close, and we have colleagues on our campus who are doing, aspiring at least to do just that. And so I think that given that has happened in only 2 decades, as now more and more people are realizing that the microbiomes of the soil, of you name it, whatever your context that you care about in the realm of sustainability, you're going to find a microbial community involved with it. What it takes are smart people getting interested in having a critical mass of people working on a problem. I think this example Victoria gave of the ruminant microbiome is prime for the taking, leveraging what has come to be understood in the context of the human gut and trying to apply it now in the context of a different gut system that has an incredible impact upon atmospheric, methane balance. It's actually a non-trivial knob to tune. But what is necessary are people who want to work on it, and the tools are in place, ready to go. And what I think makes us so excited is the fact that Caltech really has the means to encourage people, young and old, to redirect and to orient towards these important problems. And that we have the Resnick Sustainability Institute that is facilitating this. We have the Center for Environmental Microbial Interactions that's making this possible. And we have a community of scholars here that have different things to contribute towards, action-oriented solutions. And so it doesn't happen overnight. But if we can inspire and galvanize enough of our community to be working on this together, I really do believe, I'm very hopeful that before I retire, we will have made some significant contributions to this area.
Yeah. And I think, one of the really wonderful things about being in an environment like Caltech is the potential not only to train microbiologists, but also to engage talented researchers that are coming from other disciplines. And that's really, I think, going to be the secret to this success and progress is to be able to take this sort of multidisciplinary approach and have these conversations that transcend beyond one individual discipline. And really the Resnick and SEMI are good examples of being able to do that. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I feel like we could keep talking about this for forever. Thank you so much, Dianne and Victoria, for your time and for these excellent answers. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us and for your great questions. This is our last webinar of the year for the Science Exchange, but you can learn so much more from the Caltech faculty about sustainability, earthquakes, viruses, and more at scienceexchange.caltech.edu. And I highly recommend checking it out, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you.